So my interest in eclipses is both professional and personal. Professional because, as those of you who heard me yesterday know, I'm an author and I wrote a book about a long ago total eclipse across the American West. But my interest is also personal because I'm an eclipse chaser. Here I am in Australia last April. That's Chile in 2019, Aruba in 1998. But my first eclipse was in 1970. I was 5 years old, and even now, I remember the excitement of that day. For me, that partial solar eclipse, and more so the total eclipses I've seen as an adult, they're milestones in my life, like birthdays or anniversaries, but more powerful. Whenever an eclipse comes around, I reflect back on who I was the last time I stood in the moon's shadow. Well, what's true for me as an individual, I would argue, is true for America as a whole. Eclipses can serve as milestones that mark our national evolution. They're a chance to reflect on who we were as a country when the moon's shadow visited these shores before. Indeed, before I was born. July 20th, 1963, Alaska and Maine were in the path of totality. The Beatles were on the radio. JFK was in the White House. June 8th, 1918, the moon's shadow traversed the country diagonally from Washington state to Florida. Woodrow Wilson was president. World War I was nearing its end. August 7th, 1869, the path of the total solar eclipse crossed the Midwest and the South, including Tennessee, where a gubernatorial election was closely watched now that the Civil War was over and African Americans were casting votes. Suffice it to say, Americans have been fascinated with solar eclipses as long as America has existed. In the almost 250 years since our nation declared its independence, 24 total eclipses have crossed the current territory of the contiguous United States, and a few more have crossed Alaska and Hawaii. Some have particularly interesting stories to tell and were witnessed by noteworthy people, and I'll mention just a couple of examples. And thank you to Michael Zeiler for that map. My favorite eclipse, as you might imagine, is the total eclipse of 1878, the subject of my book. It crossed the American frontier from Montana Territory down to Texas, and it came at a time when the United States was looked down upon by European countries. We were seen as bumpkins, not very intellectual. Well, the eclipse of 1878, like the moon landing a century later, rallied the public around science. It gave our young country an opportunity to prove itself on the international stage when it came to astronomy. Dozens of the era's great scientists raced out to Texas, Colorado, and Wyoming to observe the eclipse, to try to solve some of the deepest mysteries of the sun and solar system. And among those who headed west was this young man, folding his arms and frowning. That's Thomas Edison. He traveled to Wyoming to see the eclipse to test a recent invention called the tesimeter. It was said at the time that it was going to be bigger than the phonograph. Well, we all know what happened with that. Also traveling west for the eclipse was the most famous female scientist in America, Maria Mitchell. She was an astronomer who taught at Vassar College, and in 1878, she led an all-female expedition to Denver, which was a scientific endeavor, but it was more than that. It was also a political statement, an early effort to show what women could do in science. More than 70 years before the 1878 eclipse, in 1806, a total eclipse crossed Ohio and upstate New York, areas that will again see the moon's shadow next April. And one notable person who witnessed that eclipse was the American writer James Fenimore Cooper, famous for his novel Last of the Mohicans. The eclipse visited his hometown of Cooperstown, New York, when he was just 17 years old. Many years later, he wrote up his memories of what for him was the most profound experience of his life. Indeed, it was a profound experience for his entire community. Women stood in the open street near me with streaming eyes and clasped hands, Cooper wrote, and sobs were audible in different directions. Even the educated and reflecting men at my side continued silent in thought. I have passed a varied and eventful life, Cooper wrote in later years. It has been my fortune to see earth, heavens, ocean, and man in most of their aspects. But never have I beheld any spectacle which so plainly manifested the majesty of the Creator or so forcibly taught the lesson of humility to man as a total eclipse of the sun. As you can see, the deeply human experience of a total eclipse has not really changed in more than 2 centuries. So here's a tip to those of you who are doing outreach in your communities for next year's eclipse. I'd encourage you to add some history to what you're doing. Not everyone is immediately interested in science, but everyone is interested in people. How did locals in your area respond when an eclipse happened generations ago? Did they celebrate? Did they cower in fear? Well, these days, thanks to the internet, it's easy to do this kind of historical research. And I've actually written an easy, free, step-by-step guide for how to create your own local eclipse history exhibit. And I'll give the URL again at the end of this talk. But I'd encourage you to check that out because it's very easy. In all of an hour or two, you could find wonderful articles from your own community about how people reacted in the 19th century or early 20th century. Anyway, just to wrap up, a final point. Eclipses don't just connect the present with the past, they connect the present with the future. Eclipses are so incredibly predictable that they encourage us not just to look backward, but forward. On January 24th, 1925, a total eclipse crossed Pennsylvania. And a few days beforehand, a local astronomer gave a lecture. He explained that this would likely be the only total eclipse that many Pennsylvanians would have an opportunity to see in their lifetimes. The next one that would come nearby, he said, would not occur until April 8th, 2024. Which makes me wonder, what will people be saying and thinking about us on August 12th, 2045? September 14th, 2099. And October 17th, 2153, when the moon's shadow will undoubtedly return to these shores, but what life will be like for those of us, for those who witness it, we can only imagine. So there is the URL for my tips on how to do your own local eclipse history exhibit, and the website for my book where you can reach me. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to talk later today or anytime. So thank you.